After the release of The Dead Next Door and Robot Ninja, work kind of dried up a bit in LA for J.R. Bookwalter, which, on a personal level, I still think is kind of surprising really, given just how entertaining and great those movies really were. Instead, after an extended period of freelancing and desk work to make ends meet, he finally decided to pack up a U-Haul and head back to Ohio. But he wasn't going back empty-handed. Instead, he had a dream, nay, a vision. He was going back to Ohio, and he was going back with purpose, to shoot a lot of movies. As soon as he arrived back in Ohio, JR bought a VHS tape camera, networked himself up a small mixed-skill team of crew members, and with funding by David Dakota's direct-to-home video label, Bookwalter began what would nowadays be seen as a near-impossible feat. Shoot 6 movies, 2 of them back-to-back at the same time, for $2,500 each, in 7 months. In industry terms, someone saying they're going to do that is a bit like if you announced now that you were going to be the next king of the North Pole. Most people would laugh, professionals wouldn't take you seriously, and very few people have ever even considered the possibility that something like that would even be feasible. But, armed with his skeleton crew, his camera, and a bold determination, Bookwalter did it. And the result is the SOV 6-pack. 6 movies between 60 and 80 minutes long from a range of genres, all linked by the fact that they were shot on tape and completed in a 7-month window over 1991 and 1992. And I feel the need here to set expectations, because, truth be told, I'm not exactly new to the SOV genre, but I'm not an old hand at it either. And this set did somewhat catch me off guard as to exactly what was in the offing. So before we get properly started, a small disclaimer. In the past, we've covered some SOV movies on this channel before, with entries such as Splat, the WNUF Halloween special, and Nutbag. And while they were proper SOV movies, they weren't true SOV movies, in the sense that they were films that were shot on either Digibeta, Mini-DV, or some kind of hybrid of analog and digital formatting. Through the 90s and into the 2000s, editing began to move from the traditional means of dubbing and cutting real-world film and tape to what would be considered more modern digital editing, done via computer. To that end, technology evolved within analog tape to embed digital signals within the magnetic strip to allow for a more stable, clearer and consistent capture into a computer editing system. These are still SOV films, but they were edited digitally, so they're kind of postmodern in that sense. Like the handover from shooting on film to shooting digitally, when SOV films made the jump from pure analog to digi, it marked the end of an era in some regards. All of these films were analog edited initially. They had digital titles and credits made up for them, and they had electronic soundtracks created, but they were all shot on analog tape, edited with analog mixing boards, and as such they give off a totally different vibe when compared to their digital counterparts. In fact, the only SOV movie I've covered on here that wasn't digitally edited was Tales from the Quedead Zone, and that only exists really as a 2nd or 3rd generation copy dubbed off a distributed tape. But what we have here in the SOV 6-pack are 6 movies that were shot on tape and presented both in their original analog edits, but also painstakingly recaptured, rebuilt and re-encoded from the best possible sources available for this set's Blu-ray re-release. Sometimes it's the master tapes, sometimes it's a 1st or 2nd generation copy. But what Bookwalter has done with this set is effectively tried to assemble and remaster these 6 films in the highest and best quality that it's possible to squeeze from VHS tapes. And the results are impressive, but very different from his remasterings of his film endeavours. You see, when people think of that generic VHS look for movies on tape, they're really generally thinking of the look of film on VHS. It has that glossy, slightly noisy look that film has, but the muzzier, lower-res quality of VHS creates a warmer, more pleasant feeling. It hides a lot of the imperfections, and the result of the conversion more often than not results in warmer colours and a murkier picture, alongside the joys of instability, tracking issues and rippling. You know, all that good stuff. Movies that were solely shot on VHS, however, are at the mercy of the camera they were filmed on, and that doesn't always equal a good time. Whereas film has high-resolution detail that can be blown up, VHS is fixed to either 428 or 624 lines of information depending on where in the world you are. You can upscale that footage, but you'll never be able to squeeze more information out of the picture than you put in to begin with. It's forever locked in that fixed lower resolution of around 480p or 520i. Well, until someone figures out a way to unlock true HD in VHS, which I would say is rather unlikely. We can stabilise the footage, and with some technical wizardry we're able to upscale the footage to a good solid 720p. But beyond that, you run the risk of artifacting, colour bleeding, destabilisation, and my favourite word, chromatic aberration. Basically, VHS is a cool format to watch your movies on, but it's a terrible format to archive your movies on if you're looking for high quality retention. But in the 80s and 90s, VHS was relatively cheap compared to shooting on film, so many amateur filmmakers shot SOV as a way of getting their movies out there one way or another. The issue with shooting SOV is, well, if your camera isn't up to spec and you don't have a fantastic supporting kit of sound, light and creative artists to help level the playing field, it just tends to look a bit washed out and not very good most of the time. Every lighting decision has to be massively overcompensated, or your shots just look dark and washed out. The 4:3 cropping and low resolution that came with low to mid-range non-studio grade cameras often resulted in pictures that, no matter how you tried to dress them up, would just look like something you'd shot in the backyard with your mates. Your practical effects have to be bomb to look passable on tape, and your sound quality equally so. If any of those elements aren't running their A game, it's a slippery slope to a production that just looks cheap and drab. And while Bookwalter has done some amazing things with this set, and I've got to make it clear here that these films for SOV movies of the early 90s look and sound phenomenal in terms of PQ and source audio, no matter which way you slice it, they're still limited by the time and resources that these movies had to work with. They're some of the best remasters of SOV footage I've ever seen, but because they were working with what they could get their hands on for the budget that they had, which wasn't a lot, they do look and sound a bit cheap. And I feel so bad for saying that because it's clear a lot of heart and soul went into remastering these movies. But they do. They look so cheap, and I can only hope that if Mr. Bookwalter is watching this, that he takes what I'm saying on the understanding that I know that it was a choice of make the movies this way or don't make them at all. And while later films in this set may use some neat workarounds to help smooth over the cracks, with the first entry in this set, 1991's Kingdom of the Vampires, it's inescapably noticeable. Now, I'm gonna be upfront here, I really didn't dig this one as much as I'd have liked to, but I think the reasoning why is kind of a perfect storm. Having just come off the back of two movies that had a slightly more reasonable budget, were shot and remastered from film elements that were both super stylised with interesting scripts and good solid pacing matched with a keen vision, we land in a somewhat pedestrian, super low budget, shot on tape, slightly washed out picture that just feels a bit lifeless compared to his earlier works. And compounding that issue further is the one bugbear I've had with Bookwalter's work since The Dead Next Door, which is the near constant bombardment of references and border full-blown scene recreations from other movies. I thought it was a bit much in The Dead Next Door, and I just about tolerated it in Robot Ninja. But here, while a lot less literally pronounced, which was nice, there are scenes in this that do feel almost identical to other movies that deal with similar themes. In particular, the three that really felt inescapable to me were Carrie, Martin, and Fade to Black. And the only thing worse than having to sit through a movie that beats you over the head with references and thematically lifted sequences from other movies is one that does that but in lower budgeted VHS quality. So after the colour and flair of Robot Ninja, to come to this straight after, well, it was a bit of a come down for me. The film follows Jeffrey, a somewhat aloof and slightly eccentric young adult working the late night shift at a Gulp and Blow to try and make ends meet. But Jeffrey has a secret, something he's, well, pretty ashamed of. Jeffrey's a vampire, but he's violently fighting against his innate urges because he just wants to live a normal life. He's recently met a girl called Nina who works late night at a local diner, and things are looking pretty positive for him. But on top of his secret, Jeffrey has another problem. His mother. Jeffrey and his mother are, as best as I can interpret, the last of the kingdom of the vampires. A few centuries previously, a vampire cult lived in Jeffrey's city, but the majority of them were destroyed by the townfolk, and Jeffrey and his mother and father were some of the last survivors, managing to escape and go into hiding. They continued to periodically feast, but they stayed indoors for the most part due to the old trope of daylight being harmful to vampires and the fact that if they were caught, they'd be killed. Jeffrey's father died some time ago, and Jeffrey's mother is now too old and unable to go out hunting for blood and relies on Jeffrey to bring fresh victims or for random passers-by to be lured into the house. She's a really nasty piece of work, constantly attacking and insulting Jeffrey, beating him regularly and forcing him to commit terrible acts to keep her fed. Jeffrey doesn't want to upset his mother, but he doesn't want to live the life of a vampire either. He's super depressed. I believe in early 21st century terms he'd be known as a right little emo. But Nina acts as a ray of sunshine that keeps him just about going. However, when Jeffrey's mother hears about a blossoming relationship between the young couple, she forbids it, attacks Jeffrey, and makes him take part in a somewhat diabolical plan. You see, Halloween's coming up, and Jeffrey's mother has the perfect idea of a way to score a few free meals. They simply make out that they've built a haunted house, lure parents and children in, and then whack them before feasting on their gooey, bloody flesh. It's a sound enough plan, but Jeffrey's totally against the idea and is eventually bullied into killing a young mother and her son who were out on their trick-or-treat rounds. And it's from here that the film picks up a bit. You see, a day or two later, a sheriff turns up at the house looking to inquire about the missing persons, and it's revealed that the mother and son were in fact the sheriff's sister-in-law and nephew. The last known whereabouts have been traced to Jeffrey's street, and as soon as Jeffrey realises that the sheriff thinks he might be involved in their disappearance, he pretty much shits himself and in a panicked flail denies everything and tries to get the sheriff off his property as soon as possible. And from here on in, the film basically turns into a bit of a pressure cooker. As Jeffrey becomes paranoid that the game is up, his mother becomes increasingly crueler and crueler, Nina becomes more involved in Jeffrey's life and starts to learn more and more dark secrets, and the town's police department begin to more closely monitor Jeffrey and the house. In a final act that, well, it's not awful. In fact, I'd say given the film that preceded it, it actually ends on a pretty decent high note. But I won't spoil what happens here. I think the biggest grief I have with this film is the script, and it's kind of a lot to unpack compared to the rest of the elements of this film. For starters, the plot itself just kind of feels like a melting pot of other movies. I often refer to the great quote from scriptwriter and editor Terrance Dicks, who once quipped that you can have an original idea, but it needn't be your original idea. And in the past I've reviewed movies on here that have taken ideas from older or more popular films and put their distinctive mark on them. But this film, to me at least, just doesn't quite uniquely identify itself enough for me. It didn't grab me in the same way that Buchwalter's other two films did. For a film that's around 70 minutes long, I spent almost the entire runtime going, oh, that bit's from Fade to Black, that bit's from Psycho, that bit's from Carrie. There was never a point while watching where I really went, okay, this feels like something I haven't seen before. I mean, it's not awfully done or anything, but it's not standout either. As a plot, it just sort of exists, which in many ways is worse than it just being bad, because if it was just bad, I could enjoy it for being that. Instead, it's mediocre, and there isn't really a lot I can do with mediocre. The pacing isn't too great either, with a first and second act that don't really have a distinctive gear change point and feel quite homogenised, pedestrian and plodding. While the third act definitely goes to ramp things up. And while that final 25 minutes or so is about as solid as this film gets, the preceding 40 to 50 minutes just feels super drawn out. This could have been a pretty tight half an hour short. Instead, while it has its moments, there's just too many exposition scenes, too many shots of people walking between locations, and too many moments of characters contemplating decisions that the audience knows they're never going to take. And probably the most annoying part of this movie is the constant backing and forth in between Jeffrey and his mother. At first, it's pretty decent, and the first few times they butt heads, it's actually pretty harrowing for this kind of filmmaking. But just the repetition of it happening over and over again became super irritating. And by about halfway through the second act, it's a total "we get it, she's a witch" moment. I just got so annoyed with it, truth be told, that in the end I kind of burnt out all of the last of my goodwill I had towards this script. And given that, for full disclosure, romance plotlines in movies aren't my strongest love, I felt very much like this was a case of a script not being made for me. It's literally just a repetitious loop of Jeffrey working at the store, hanging with Nina for a bit, going to argue with his mother, having to deal with a murder, going back to the store, for 70 minutes. And it really doesn't break that formula even 10 minutes before the end credits roll. So yeah, it really wasn't my cup of tea. And what really doesn't fill me with confidence is that in the making of for this feature, pretty much everyone contributing to it said that this was the best one in the set. So now, I'm only a little bit utterly petrified about what I've let myself in for. Honest. Help. Joining Bookwalter in writing this script was Matthew Jason Walsh. He has 45 writing credits and also helped write the next film in this series, Zombie Cop. He mainly seems to do low-budget horror and sci-fi flicks with such titles as Final Scream, Bram Stoker's Legend of the Mummy 2 and Biker Babes from Beyond the Grave. And it seems his writing ability has come a fair way since this picture. On the direction front, we actually don't fare too badly. It's weird really, because this film somehow seems to get more competent as it progresses. Like, the opening shots of this movie feel like a home movie. They have almost no stylization about them. They look dark, washed out, stiff, and lacking any kind of clear directorial vision. But slowly but surely as the film goes on, that distinct Bookwalter style begins to creep back into the movie, until by around about the halfway point, this is actually looking and feeling pretty decent. And by the end, visually, I was pretty much on board. About 50 minutes into this, I nailed exactly what the issue was with not only the direction, but also the cine in this movie. Where they were working in closed sets, actual homes, stores, offices, the direction and cine is crafted, well structured, and looks great with really clean execution. Outdoor scenes though? Forget it. Barring a single set of location shots of Jeffrey's house at night that look good, the majority of the on-location shoots are shaky, dark, shot for function not purpose, stiff, and ick. Really ick. And while cast direction has been a bit of a minefield up to this point in his career, here we probably see the most marked improvement, with the cast trying to work with their locations as well as they can, and in particular, while I moaned earlier about Jeffrey and his mother's arguing scenes, I gotta say, in terms of direction of those scenes, they're brilliant. Getting right in your face and being as overbearing as possible. It makes you really feel like you're in Jeffrey's shoes, so big thumbs up from me there. The cine, as mentioned earlier, suffers a similar fate to the direction. The on-set stuff really experiments, and while Dutch angles and some crash zooms run rampant and repetitively throughout the middle of this thing, the intermittent use of coloured gel lights and a nice mix of shot types really helped win me over by somewhat diffusing that repetition in those scenes. And especially for the budget and the fact this is SOV, I think they really do well in achieving what they set out to do. Performance-wise, well, subjectively the cast did what was asked of them. Whether what was asked of them resulted in an enjoyable movie, however, well, that's a different story. The film's co-writer, Matthew Jason Walsh, here plays Jeff, and Jeff's a traumatised and upset eccentric individual. The problem is that that's not really a fun character to be stuck with for 70 minutes, especially when there's a lot of repetition. So while I think Walsh nails exactly what was needed for the character and really goes all out to give a great performance, the faults with the script mentioned earlier just ultimately make the character come across as super whiny, screechy, and a bit of a drag to hang with. It's a similar story with Sherry Patry as Jeff's mum. She's asked to play an absolute harpy, an unbearable, suffocating, abusive presence, and she totally nails that expertly. The problem is we're stuck with that unbearable character for the majority of the runtime too. So between her and Jeff, we get almost no respite from the utter, for lack of a better word, emo-ification that plays out over the runtime. This movie has fun moments, but in and of itself, it's just a quite dark, sad, bleak film that really needed a bit of a kick up the arse in terms of likeable and more playful characters. The one positive performance in the whole thing is Shannon Doyle as Nina, and being kind, this is not the finest hour of acting I've ever seen. She's stiff, the tone of her deliveries waver all over the place, and I really feel she wasn't 100% confident in remembering the script. I get that it's a high-pressure environment, but I was counting on Nina to give me a decent performance that I could use as a life jacket to help keep me afloat with this movie. And sadly, it all rather came to a bit of a damp squib. But, ending on a positive note, the soundtrack's ace. One of the things that's becoming quickly apparent is that Bookwalter doesn't have a tin ear. This is a fantastic soundtrack that's been cleaned up wonderfully for this release and has a lovely, slightly cheap but crisp 90s synth vibe to it. I loved it, and I'm so glad I went for this box set because, if nothing else, just being able to own these fantastic soundtracks all in one set is worth the price of admission alone. Kingdom of the Vampires was released on VHS in 1991 in the US. I'm having conflicting reports of a UK VHS release, but I can say that it definitely got a UK DVD release in 2005 courtesy of a company called Screamhouse. Finally, in 2020, it was released as part of the very high-quality SOV 6-pack set, released by Makeflix. And this is the best these films will look, hands down. It's nothing short of miraculous what they've been able to pull with these films. Fully restored with a choice of various 5.1 surround mixes, a 2.0 mix, and a couple of commentary tracks to boot, this looks wonderful. And with a decent raft of extras too, including trailers, a making of, deleted scenes, bloopers and more, while this film may not be perfect, I'm definitely glad I picked it up. Kingdom of the Vampires was a bit of a bump back down to earth for me after riding high with Bookwalter's other movies. I appreciate that this film was produced on a drastically reduced budget and that there were several other limiting factors, and that at the end of the day there's only so much you can achieve with a skeleton crew, a VHS camera and a 3 to 6 week turnaround, but that doesn't excuse some of the faults this film has. Setting aside that the plot themes used throughout weren't really my cup of tea right out of the gate, we're still stuck with heavy-handed references to other, better movies, the pacing is a crawl at times, and the cast, while acing the brief on performances, do too good of a job and end up actually coming across as super annoying. With that being said, what we have here is some keen and creative direction and cine for a good chunk of the run, a killer soundtrack and performances that, whether I like them or not, did meet the required brief. Not to mention that I'll physically fist fight anyone who says they've seen a better set of SOV remasters outside of this set. I just kind of feel a bit conflicted about this movie. It didn't annoy me outright, but it definitely didn't win me over either. It's probably my least favourite of Bookwalter's films that I've seen so far, and I don't think I could really recommend it given how good some SOV movies can be. But you know what? You can't be lucky every time. And next time, I feel like we may be onto a winner when we take a look at Zombie Cop.